PTSD in Taxi Driver by Matthew Davidson. Taxi Driver is an American neo-noir thriller film released in 1976 and directed by Martin Scorsese. The film's primary character is Travis Bickle, a lonely 26-year-old man living in isolation in New York City. He suffers from a severe form of insomnia and thus works the night shift as a taxi driver to cope. He frequents porn theaters and keeps a diary of grievances for a city that simultaneously sustains him, yet is the object of his immense psychosexual hatred. His diary includes lines like, "Loneliness has followed me my whole life, everywhere. In bars, in cars, sidewalks, stores, everywhere. There is no escape. I am God's lonely man." Travis is a veteran of the Vietnam War, and he's the embodiment of the national trauma in post-war. The plot of the movie has us observe Travis's psychological downfall into a type of paranoid psychosis, where the subtle elements of PTSD are made visible for the first time in film. The term post-traumatic stress disorder came into use in the literature in the 1970s and was discovered as a result of the trauma-inducing conditions of the war in Vietnam. PTSD is categorized by the DSM-5 as being a trauma and stressor-related disorder. As a veteran of the Vietnam War, Travis likely acquired some form of PTSD, as is made obvious by the film and the set of actions his character pursues over the course of the plot. PTSD, as defined by the DSM-5, requires the satisfaction of 8 different criterion for diagnosis. In this presentation, I will discuss Travis's satisfaction of the DSM-5 criteria for PTSD, his symptoms, and the various considerations of his treatment. The DSM-5 defines alterations in arousal and reactivity as manifesting in the following ways. In 1, irritability or aggression, 2, risky or destructive behavior, 3, hypervigilance, 4, heightened startle reaction, 5, difficulty concentrating, and 6, difficulty sleeping. For Travis, many of these symptoms guide his actions and serve as the structure according to which the film progresses. The film's central phase of scenes has us observe Travis's relationship to the city and the radical degradation of his psyche inside it. The scene I would point to that best demonstrates Travis as behaving in ways consistent with the definition of PTSD is when he shoots the local pimp Sport in an act of spontaneous aggression. Travis's actions in the scene are consistent with how PTSD is said to manifest itself psychologically, as Travis impulsively seeks a state of control that he believes can only be achieved through violence. In the context of the film, the scene is the point at which Travis's hatred for the city's culture is explicated through hypervigilance and his exaggerated intensity of behavior. The criterion of PTSD that Travis's behavior excludes is an avoidance or the mitigation of trauma-related stimuli. Travis, throughout the later end of the film, appears very keen to engage in the sorts of behaviors that might be related to his trauma in war. The final act of the film makes this very clear, as Travis takes on the role of a vigilante and recruits the identity of a warrior whose mission is to disturb society and advance its decay. These overtly aggressive behaviors are counterexamples to the notion that Travis experiences avoidance in his PTSD. PTSD is a complex illness, and in the case of the character of Travis Bickle, the best form of treatment will be one that is holistic and attentive to the biopsychosocial explanations of human behavior. There are several recommended modes of therapy for PTSD, with the basic premise of each being that the victim should attempt to flesh out traumatic experiences in a controlled environment. A long-term treatment plan for Travis will likely be in regimented cognitive therapy alongside some scheduled dose of prescription medicine. There are many ethical concerns involved in the treatment of PTSD. The concerns that I would argue are the most important are in 1, accurate diagnosis, 2, helpful versus harmful modes of treatment, and in 3, abuse disclosure, i.e. addressing the causes of trauma. Taxi Driver's portrayal of Travis Bickle was not about his contention with PTSD. Although PTSD was an important aspect of Travis Bickle's character, the film's main concern was in effectively developing the pathos of an anti-hero and in exploring the violent clash between modernity and the essential nature of Travis Bickle. In this way, PTSD was not accurately presented in Taxi Driver, as Travis's illness was much more an implication of the movie than it was an essential theme. I think that if done correctly, film can be amongst the most effective of communication devices for conveying how psychological disorders might manifest, the variables of mental illness, and how having a mental illness does not make us any less human. I think that film naturally entices our empathy for other human beings and can make us much more aware of the ways in which victims of mental illness experience the world. As far as stigma goes, PTSD's primary burden lies inside the types of traumas that can cause it. The general public, I think, tends to underestimate the number of traumas that can potentially lead to the development of PTSD. There is a widespread stigma that a valid diagnosis of PTSD can only be the consequence of war, and that trauma experienced outside of war is never adequate enough for an official PTSD diagnosis. I think that PTSD and almost all forms of mental illness are universal across cultures. I think that what mental illness is really is human beings' reconciliation with the fact of having a mind that has been damaged in some fundamental way. PTSD is just one of the many disorders that I think are emergent across our species given the right sets of conditions.